Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and apologies for the technical difficulties that we've had on my end. I'm pleased to welcome you to NCFAR's webinar regarding U.S. agriculture export and global competitiveness. Really excited about our lineup of speakers today, and I'm working to pull up our slides, if you'll bear with me just a minute. But today's program, we wanted to talk to you about some of the critical agriculture programs that we have at USDA that helps us stay competitive in the U.S. global marketplace. And while I try to pull up the slides here, just a couple of housekeeping notes. We will hear from our distinguished panel, and then at the end, we'll have a period of question and answers. And we ask that you mute yourself unless you're called on to speak during the Q&A. And then also, we will also allow for you to put your questions in the chat at any time during the presentation. And so let's get started. So a little bit about NCFAR. It's the National Coalition for Food and Agriculture Research, and is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, consensus-based, and customer-led organization that brings together food, agriculture, nutrition, conservation, and natural resource stakeholders to serve as a forum and a unified voice supporting increased federal investment in USDA research, education, and economics. And over the years, NCFAR has hosted tens of thousands of attendees at hundreds of seminars and webinars like this Lunch and Learn. The goal of these signature events is to educate and empower staff on Capitol Hill and policy stakeholders about the importance and the value of public investment in food and agriculture research. NCFAR's popular Lunch and Learn series and webinars feature experts from institutions across the country sharing expertise on a wide range of topics. The events shifted most recently during the pandemic to a virtual format, which allows us greater geographic reach and participation. And I'd encourage you to access the previous webinars that we've had during the years off of NCFAR's website. That's ncfar.org, and you can find that under Education Webinars. And today's webinar is the last webinar of the calendar year. And you can also connect with NCFAR via their Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook accounts. And I just want to say thank you to NCFAR for the program today. Corn Refiners Association, we're a proud member and sponsor of NCFAR, and we're really excited to be engaged in this event today. So let me try to pull up our list for our share with you the slides now, and then we'll go into the presentations. Well, while I work on that, let me just say we want to thank our sponsors. NCFAR wants to thank our Lunch and Learn sponsors for this series. That is Eversol Associates, the Extension Committee on Organization and Policy, ECOP, and SOAR Foundation. So as I mentioned before, please mute yourself. I'm very excited to have this distinguished panel before us today. We will hear from three experts at USDA who play a critical role and are distinguished in their respective sections of USDA. You think about an orchestra and first chairs, that's what we have here today. We have an all-star lineup. We're going to hear from three individuals, Keith Fugly, Gene Bailey, and Mark Slupak from USDA. And just to kind of tee it off before we turn it over to Mark, just want to mention the importance of agriculture exports and global markets for U.S. farmers, producers, and ranchers. American agriculture is the most productive and sustainable in the world, with 95% of the world's consumers overseas. It should be no surprise that 20% of U.S. agriculture revenues are derived from exports. In the agriculture sector, we like to say, if we grow it, raise it, or produce it, we likely export it. Therefore, foreign markets are vital to American farmers, ranchers, and producers. Agriculture exports support over 1 million American jobs, including 750,000 jobs in the non-farm sector. Every dollar of agriculture exports stimulates another $1.27 of business activity in the U.S. economy. And in fact, the farm to fork U.S. agriculture supply chain is one of the largest employers of manufacturing and of all jobs in the United States. So with that, I'm pleased to turn it over to Keith for his presentation. Please take it away, Keith.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Appreciate that introduction, and I am very pleased to be here. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks to the attendees for coming to today's session. Let me pull up a few slides that I'd like to share with you, and let me know when you can see these. Let me put it in presentation mode. Michael, are these visible?
Perfect, Keith. Thank you. They look great.
Great. What I'd like to talk about really is focus on the critical role that productivity plays in U.S. agricultural growth and competitiveness, and just present some data and some concerns about long-term competitiveness of U.S. agriculture and what policy might do about that. Throughout the last half century or more, productivity has really been the primary driver of growth of U.S. agriculture. What this graph shows is an index of the total volume of output of crop and livestock commodities relative to where we were in 1948, and compared with the total amount of land, labor, capital, and intermediate inputs that are employed to produce that output. The index value of output today is about 280 compared to 100 in 1948, meaning we're producing 2.8 times the volume of output. And yet the total amount of resources employed to produce that is really about the same as it was back in 1948. Certainly there's some substitution in input mix. There's more capital and intermediate inputs and less labor and land. But when we add those up and think about the cost of production, we are basically producing all of this increased output by raising the efficiency and productivity of those resources. In fact, we put together this measure we call total factor productivity, or TFP, which is basically simply the ratio of these total outputs to total inputs. And we can see how TFP really tracks output growth. And this basically says that TFP is what's the driver of growth in the U.S. agricultural sector. This is quite different from the rest of the economy, where if you look at the total GDP of the United States, about half of that growth comes from bringing in more labor and capital resources, and about half from TFP. In agriculture, it's all about productivity. And in fact, the way that we construct this index of TFP has direct implications for trade competitiveness as well as profitability of the agricultural sector. A 1% increase in TFP implies a 1% reduction in the unit cost of production, as if prices don't change, because basically we're using 1% fewer resources to produce that output. But suppose prices start working against farmers. Suppose output prices are falling relative to input prices. Well, that higher TFP can keep agricultural profitable even when you have those adverse terms of trade affecting agriculture. I wanted to go and drill down a little bit more into the growth story of U.S. agriculture and divide it up into these three major factors as to what's contributing to growth over time. You can look at changes in land use, as well as, and then the increased yield on that land as one simple decomposition of where growth is coming from. But that yield growth itself can be broken up into how much is due to increased input intensification on that land, more intermediate inputs, more capital, more labor, and how much of it is due to this TFP, this raising the total productivity or efficiency of the use of those resources. These are directly linked to different policy instruments as well. TFP growth is driven over the long term by investments in knowledge capital, the research and development to develop new technologies, as well as the extension services and education and other enabling institutions that allow farmers ready access to new technology and so they can adopt it efficiently. Input use and land use is really driven by current market conditions. When prices are high, you'll see more input intensification. When prices are low, farmers won't invest in much. But the one critical aspect of this is that input use and land use as a source of growth faces diminishing returns. You can only go so far relying on these sources for growth. Whereas total factor productivity, so long as we're investing sufficiently in research and development, is a kind of growth that can be sustained over time. And R&D investments have been shown to have a high payoff, and we see no evidence that there's any kind of that we're running out of steam there, that those R&D returns are continuing to be high even today. So if we do this growth decomposition for US agriculture, and here I've broken it out for see where growth is coming from for different periods going back to 1960. We can see that in the 70s and 60s through 70s and 80s and 90s, US output growth was almost 2% per year. And a lot of that growth was coming from raising total factor productivity. We had some input intensification, but then land use was negative. So land has been leaving the sector. And that increased input intensification was just kind of offsetting those declining amount of land in production, so that really net growth net of input change was all due to raising total factor productivity. But then if we look at the last couple of decades, we do see a substantial slowdown in the rate of growth of US output. And particularly in the last decade, we're now growing output at less than 1% per year. And productivity has basically stagnated. We're not getting that increase in TFP that we used to have that was driving that increase in output. So some of the challenges facing this future growth in US agricultural productivity has been a declining investment in agricultural R&D, which is slowing the pace of innovation and this productivity growth. And I'm going to go more into this in a few minutes. But we also have, consumer attitudes and apprehensions with some technologies and farming practices, such as biotechnology. That also tends to restrict choices that farmers and researchers have and what kind of technologies they're willing to adopt or invest in. Climate change increasingly is proposing a risk to crop productivity. And then in some environmental constraints, particularly water scarcity in Western states, is another big threat to productivity. Let's compare how US is faring against some of our major competitors. And here I'm showing productivity indexes for the United States and Europe and China, India, and Brazil, compared to an index of starting in the year 2000. Whereas US agricultural TFP has remained quite low and stagnated over the last decade or more, it continues to increase in these other countries. And what this means is that US trade competitiveness is falling behind. And now if we compare this to this potential, this primary policy instrument, investments in public research and development, again, we see US falling and lagging behind these same set of major competitors. US investments have declined in real terms, peaking more than a decade ago, whereas R&D spending in these other countries continue to increase. And note particular China in blue. They have dramatically increased research and development spending for agriculture over the last couple of decades. So we see a real strong correlation between investment in R&D and the rate of growth. And the US isn't looking very good in these matters. Now, I want to make another comparison between North America and Europe in total factor productivity trends, as well as output and input use, just to illustrate that productivity is not all about raising output. In North America, which, as Michael noted, has a strong historical comparative advantage in agriculture, we tend to use productivity to raise output, but saving resources or at least keeping resources from rising. Not only the market resources, but also environmental resources. And here I've shown trends in greenhouse gas emissions from the agricultural sector. And as you can see, that basically tracks how much inputs you use, not how much output you're getting. Now in Europe, on the other hand, they've also had productivity growth, but output has remained constant, and that productivity is basically further reducing inputs, including environmental inputs in agriculture. So in North America's case, as Michael mentioned, these output growth has been very important because we're a major exporter, as well as we've used a lot of that increased output for renewable energy production. So just to refresh our memory on what this primary policy instrument for productivity, the R&D complex of the United States, we have the federal government providing about 70% of the investment in public ag R&D. State governments are another major funder, as well as private sources, private foundations, as well as companies and other private non-government sources provide some money for this system. But about 2/3 of the R&D is actually performed at state institutions, the land-grant universities, veterinary schools, and other cooperating institutions. And then the other third by USDA intramural research agencies. Now, my colleagues this morning, Mark and Jean, are going to be talking about some particular programs within the USDA intramural research that are designed to really gain and protect market access to foreign markets, which, as Michael mentioned, is such an important dimension or market for U.S. agricultural products. So just let me wrap up with some key takeaways: that the U.S. agriculture depends critically on raising productivity for its growth and competitiveness. And that productivity growth can also reduce the environmental footprint of agriculture. I showed how there's less land being used in agriculture, and we've also reduced greenhouse gas emissions per unit of output. So we're basically, with productivity, decoupling agriculture increasingly from the use of environmental resources. However, U.S. agricultural productivity has shown stagnation over the last decade. R&D investment is falling and lagging behind major competitors, and this puts at risk U.S. ag trade competitiveness and will likely make our production become more resource intensive unless this trend is reversed. So thank you for that, Michael. Let me turn it over now to my USDA colleagues, Mark and Jean. I'm going to unshare my slides.
Thank you, Keith. And Jean, when you're ready, please go ahead. Let me just make a quick introduction. I wanted to just recount that Mark's a senior, Keith's a senior economist at USDA's Economic Research Service, and ERS, for an acronym for you, produces a wealth of research, including this TFP that Mark talked about. This very critical for policymakers and for stakeholders in the ag community. So let me turn it over to Jean now, who's Deputy Administrator of Trade Policy and Geographic Affairs at USDA at the Foreign Agriculture Service. Thank you, Jean.
Thank you, Michael. And can you hear me and can you see my slides?
Very well, both audio and visual. Thank you.
Very good. Well, again, thank you, Michael, and to the Corn Refiners Association and to NCFAR for this opportunity to talk about how USDA research can support that agricultural trade competitiveness. And Michael, you briefly talked about the importance of US food and agricultural exports, not just to the rural economy, but actually to the whole United States economy. And in addition to that economic support, our exports support food security. Global food security is a topic that USDA has been front and center, and US farmers have been front and center in for decades, but now this is a discussion on the global stage, and our ag exports play a big role in helping that ensure other countries can also meet their food security needs. Let's take a very quick look first at, I want to see the slides. There we go. Take a quick
Jean?
look. Yes, sir.
Yeah, if you could expand it to full screen, that might be a little bit easier to see some of the detail.
How about that?
Okay, perfect.
I
Thank
know
you. Sorry
font
for the
point 2
error.
is not good. All right. So let's take a quick look at USDA so we can see where are the majority of our research agencies are, and then where does the Foreign Agricultural Service fit in. So let's take a look right here. You can see we have the Research and Education and Economics mission area. And in that mission area, we have 5 agencies. Mr. Fugly is with the Economic Research Service, but 5 agencies that really focus on hardcore scientific research to support US food and agricultural domestic production, and also how they can research analytics, how they can research scientific solutions to problems that face our exports. Now to the right of, and I'm trying to, the slides are showing up on my screen, and so I'm not sure if you're seeing it the same way I am. Let's try and go back. There we go. Whoops, sorry folks. To the right of, so REE is the mission area where most of USDA's scientific agencies are housed. We also have scientific research that comes out of the Forest Service, our Ag Marketing Service, the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, the Food Safety Inspection Service. But again, the majority of USDA scientific research comes out of this mission area. Now, not right next to the REE mission area is the Trade and Foreign Agricultural Affairs mission area, and that's where the Foreign Agricultural Service is. So what does FAS do? In a nutshell, we expand US agricultural exports by removing trade barriers, helping develop global markets using strong rules-based and science-based trading systems, and we also promote an enabling environment for climate-smart agricultural innovation. We have about 1,100 staff based in Washington and in 96 offices around the world. That includes not only our foreign service, but also our locally employed staff, without whom we can't do our jobs. But we are a trade agency that promotes agricultural exports, whether it is a food product, feed, fiber, fuel. If it is, as you said, Michael, at the beginning of the presentation, if it is grown or produced, then we want to export it. You talked about 20% of US ag production in average being exported, but there are some products that actually have 50 to 80% of domestic production being exported. That would include, for example, our cotton, our almonds, and our sorghum. This is just a tip of the iceberg snapshot of what US food and agricultural exports get sold around the world. But I want to point out that this covers everything from Washington apples to Alabama poultry, Wisconsin dairy to Nebraska corn. This talks about Iowa pork, North Dakota wheat, Illinois soybeans, Arkansas rice, California tree nuts, and Georgia cotton. From coast to coast, US food and agricultural producers depend on having access to the export markets around the world. Now, any agricultural export is in one way or another dependent on science. Science, USDA science in particular, can be behind the varieties of products that are grown. USDA science can be used to convince our trading partners that we are meeting safety and health regulations. We can also use our science to show that our products are free from pests and diseases, and we use our science at USDA to extrapolate trade trends and markets that farmers can consider when making their planting decisions. However, when countries choose not to follow science, it makes our access to markets much more difficult. And for those of you who are Worldle fans, do not worry, I'm going to tell you what these countries and trading blocks are. Let's start with, I'm going to give you a few examples of where trading partners not using science have hampered US food and agricultural exports. Number one, People's Republic of China. Right now, the PRC is insisting that we have a facility registration process for foreign entities that want to export food and agricultural products, a wide range of those. This PRC requirement that any foreign facility has to be registered and this is an additional burden on top of already existing import requirements, has nothing to do with food safety. There is no science behind this requirement. The PRC has noted food safety as the reasoning behind the measure. They have not been able to provide a scientific basis, however, for implementing this. So while it has nothing to do with food safety, this new measure places an undue burden on US exporters and the competent authorities who have to try and comply with this request. And this measure is jeopardizing upwards of $2 billion of food and agricultural exports to the PRC. Moving to number 2, this is the Gulf Cooperation Council trading bloc. And they have taken a page, unfortunately, out of China's, the PRC's book, and they have likewise introduced a registration scheme for foreign facilities. It's a food registration measure. It does not identify a clear food safety health benefit, and it is vague on implementation. This measure, if it is fully implemented, will impact at least $1.8 billion of US food and agricultural exports to the GCC. Again, we ask our trading partners to point to the science when they put these sorts of measures in. If they say it's a food safety measure, in the absence of that, markets close to our products. Moving now to India, number 3, India has a long-standing ban on the import of genetically modified products for seed, human food, and animal feed, but they have never provided any science to support the ban. On top of that ban, last March of 2021, the government of India doubled down on its anti-GE stance by requiring every food product consignment from any supplier in the world of a list of 24 crops to be accompanied by a non-GM origin certificate issued by the competent authority in the country of export. The United States and other like-minded trading partners have continued to resist providing this kind of certification. We do not do this. The science has proven that GE products are completely safe, and this is something that we have been growing and using for 30 plus years in the United States. On top of that, it creates a huge burden on the regulatory agencies. Without the Indian ban on this list of GE products and this new import requirement, US exports to India would be far greater than the current 1.9 billion that we ship to them. Let's move a little closer to home in Chile. We have concerns around the world about eating healthier diets, we want to know what we consume. And so countries have introduced a plethora of labeling schemes to try and tell their consumers what's in the product they're consuming. However, in the case of Chile, Chile has introduced a front of pack labeling scheme that has a big stop sign on it to try to warn the consumers that a product could be high in sugar or salt. Chile is making these determinations on how much sugar or salt would be healthy. They're requiring this label, and if you want to continue to ship your products to Chile, you have to adopt this. It's an expense. It's not based on a scientific measure, and it introduces confusion to many consumers. They see a big stop sign, and it can create some concern about what is it that I'm actually eating. Is it a safe product? So front of pack labeling is another area not based on science, and it creates barriers to US food and agricultural exports. Last but not least, let's take a look at our friends down under in Australia. In 2003, there was a finding of BSE in the United States. 10 years later, the United States gained negligible risk status, and all beef products from all ages of cattle should be able to be traded freely. However, nearly 10 years after, so nearly 20 years after this finding, Australia continues to ban US beef imports. There is no science supporting that ban. They are not using the science that is out there. These are just a handful of examples, and I wanted to show the world map because I want you to see that It is not specific to any one country. It impacts our markets around the world. Now, on the flip side, I'd like to show you quickly when US trading partners do follow science, how it helps keep our markets open. We're going to start with the European Union trading block number 1. And again, I'm going to cite some ERS study that Mr. Fugli's organization put together. In May of 2020, the European Union unveiled its vision for preserving and protecting biodiversity and designing a fair, healthy, and environmentally friendly food system. This was called their Farm to Fork and Biodiversity Strategies. When they published it, USDA took a look at it and was very concerned that what the EU was proposing would not only significantly reduce EU agricultural production, but would also impact agricultural production of other countries who might follow suit. FAS worked with ERS, asked them to do a deep study on this, and in November of 2020, ERS completed its analysis and issued a report finding that if the EU implemented its strategies as proposed, it could have significant negative impact on its farmers through reduced agricultural production and through its consumers, not just in the EU, but worldwide, because of higher prices. ERS, that study is now used as the gold standard. It was the only impact assessment available that early in the process. And so the EU took the ERS study and shared it with EU legislators, member state representatives, and its own farm groups to help them understand some of the negative impacts of this farm to fork strategy. As of today, the farm to fork strategy has not been fully implemented. The EU has moved forward with some of its components, but the ERS analysis actually caused folks to pause, tap the brakes, and rethink what they might be doing. Now, if we zoom into number 2, I want to take a quick look at France, a member of the EU, one of its biggest agricultural producers. In 2020, France said we want to have home compostable stickers on all fresh fruits and vegetables. France doesn't have its own home compostable sticker, but they put in this regulation that there's going to have to be home compostable stickers on all fruit and vegetable imports, exports, and local production. This proposed requirement would hit $72 million in US sweet potato exports and nearly $9 million in grapefruit exports. FAS was able to uniquely work together with scientists at USDA's Agricultural Research Service. We were able to leverage our Technical Assistance to Specialty Crops program at FAS. I know my colleague Mark Slupek is going to talk about that just a bit more. And together between ARS, industry, and an FAS program, we were able to develop a home compostable PLU sticker. It would normally take 5 to 10 years to develop that kind of sticker, but because we were able to leverage USDA science and a USDA grant, we were able to get the sticker produced. It is now, a prototype is out, and we've done it in 1 year, and we will be able to use this sticker to preserve fruit and vegetable exports to this very important market, not just in France, but if France is picking it up, it's likely that other colleagues in the EU, other countries, could follow suit. I'm moving over to the Philippines. Thanks to USDA scientists who 30 years ago worked in helping to develop a beta-carotene-rich rice variety called golden rice, the Philippines has now approved for cultivation golden rice cultivars. It took them 20 years to open up that market to cultivate this rice. But that rice will help prevent blindness in children and susceptibility to severe diseases. And again, USDA scientists were key in helping develop this varietal that has taken 20 years to get into the Philippines market for cultivation. I want to underscore how long sometimes these scientific resolutions take. Zip quickly closer to home to Canada. The United States is the 3rd largest producer of plums in the world. So Canada is our biggest market, right there to the north. However, there is a virus called the plum pox virus. It impacts not just the production, but the size of the fruit, and you can have limited production. It causes millions of dollars of damage to a crop. We are very interested, obviously, in controlling that disease and not having it enter the United States. So USDA's Agricultural Research Service scientists were able to develop a genetically engineered plum that's resistant to the plumpox virus. That plum was approved for cultivation in the United States in 2007, and it has now been approved to be marketed in Canada in 2021. So from 2007 to 2021, 14 years, it took that long to get this product marketed in Canada, but because of being proactive, we're able to preserve this market. And then last but not least, let's go down to Hispaniola, Dominican Republic, and Haiti and talk about African swine fever. It is an incredibly contagious disease among pigs. Gaining control over African swine fever is crucially important, not just to swine producers in the United States, but worldwide. The virus has not reached the United States, but the outbreak last July in the DR in Haiti caused huge alarm in the United States, and of course, for our trading partners throughout America and Central America. If there were an outbreak of swine fever in the United States, other countries will close their markets to pork exports, which could impact $8.1 billion in trade. And that's just for the pork exports. There would, of course, be the knock-on effect of lost feed used. So it's an incredibly, it's a deadly virus, and it's something that we are keen to not have enter into the United States. In partnership with Vietnam, the Agricultural Research Service has been working on a ASF vaccine. It's actually led to an approved vaccine that is being pilot tested in Vietnam in April of this year. And we have high hopes that that is something that we will be able to pilot and test in other countries. Again, this is Agricultural Research Service in USDA that is bringing a scientific solution to address a potentially huge trade issue. I've gone through a number of examples rather quickly, but we could go to any country on this map and point to where science, when it's adopted and embraced, helps trade. When it's ignored, it hurts trade. And with that, I want to close with a picture of our scientists working on the African swine fever virus. And Michael, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Jean. That's very impactful to see how research translates into real world applications, whether they're a barrier or promoting, whether it's promoting the golden rice variety or resisting nature as it impacts our safety of food and our cultivation of food products. So thank you very much for that. Let me just remind our audience, feel free to put your questions in the chat. We'll now turn it over to Mark Slupek, who is Deputy Administrator of Global Programs at USDA's FAS. So Mark, take it away. And please enlarge your slide when you're doing your presentation. Thank you, Mark.
All right, thank you, Michael. Can people see my slides right now?
Yep, they look perfect.
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
terrific. Thank you. Thanks, Michael, and thanks to everybody involved in this opportunity to share some of the things that we do with you today. I'm Mark Slupek. I'm the Deputy Administrator for Global Programs at the Foreign Ag Service. My program area delivers about 30 different programs, all of which have some sort of research angle involved. Some of them actually provide research opportunities directly. Some are just supported by research as we develop the programs and deliver them. I'm going to go quickly because I know that we're running a little late on time. And I can't seem to advance my slide. Oh, here we go. Okay. We should be on a slide that says development projects. I hope that's the case. So development projects are one thing that we fund in global programs on behalf of FAS. FAS organizes, funds, and delivers agricultural economic development projects around the world. I'm going to share some examples, sort of the way Gene did, probably a little less depth. To address climate-fueled desert locust outbreaks in East Africa, FAS supported USDA's Agricultural Research Service in successfully mapping the desert locust genome using locust samples provided by partner institutions in Africa. This genome mapping is in search of the genetic controls of swarming, which is when locusts cause their crop-devouring devastation. The next bullet you see about the Republic of Georgia, one way to help a country improve its production of agricultural data, which is so important for food and trade security, trade and food security, is to collaborate with its Agricultural Statistics Authority to assess its procedures and processes, and then present the findings for use in any capacity building efforts that might follow. FAS is supporting USDA's National Agricultural Statistics Service with such an assessment in the Republic of Georgia under the Caucasus Agricultural Development Initiative. The third bullet about the Northern Triangle, building resilience to the effects of climate change in order to reduce food insecurity and migration is a key objective within the US strategy to address the root causes of migration in Central America. In support of this objective, FAS has funded a research partnership with the Costa Rican-based Tropical Agricultural Research and Higher Education Center, or CATIE in the Spanish acronym, to conduct an assessment of agricultural resilience to the effects of climate change in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Other partners include the Ag Research Service, the Forest Service, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, all three USDA partner agencies. The Cacao for Peace project in Colombia, research has been a key component of this project. It has included FAS-developed research to understand and inhibit the uptake of heavy metal cadmium by cacao plants and mapping of soil properties in cacao areas. USDA has worked with Colombian and international research institutions, which have all been part of the project, which aims in part to improve the quality of cacao available to the US fine chocolate industry. The aquaculture bullet, under our Food for Progress program, we are coordinating trials to determine the efficacy of various potential feeds in the nascent aquaculture industry in Bangladesh. That work is ongoing with the US soybean industry. And finally, also under Food for Progress, we are sponsoring the use of drones to help improve traceability and thus marketability in the growing West African cashew industry. I'm going to move on to our fellowship programs, hit a couple of them and then mention the rest. FAS utilizes the Norman Borlaug International Agricultural Science and Technology Fellowship program to provide research opportunities to international researchers and scientists in areas of mutual interest. Some recent research topics include biotechnology, biosafety regulations, African swine fever detection methods, and risk analysis for meat products. We also have the Scientific Cooperation Research Program to continue collaboration on scientific topics that are of shared interest with partnering countries. Some of the upcoming research topics include technology-driven climate-resistant aquaculture, drought stress tolerance for improved rice production, and the impact of using certain cover crops on organic farming. In addition to these, we have 5 other fellowship programs to connect research scientists and in many cases, government officials. These programs are very successful in producing future government leaders overseas that are friendly to the United States and our ways of doing business. The next slide is about our trade and regulatory capacity building efforts. FAS is working with USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service in the Dominican Republic, Gene mentioned this, to share and implement best practices to combat African swine fever based on the latest research. This is critical, of course, as Gene pointed out, to the US pork industry due to the proximity of the DR to the United States and the possibility of transmission of this terrible disease. FAS also helps other countries understand the importance of codex, the international food standard setting body, by helping them establish new Codex maximum pesticide residue levels, or MRLs, which often starts with research through in-country field trials. Finally, at FAS's request, USDA's Economic Research Service has researched and published an analysis of US free trade agreements with developing countries, noting the important role that trade capacity building plays in helping developing countries fully realize the benefits of trade agreements, particularly through providing sanitary and phytosanitary technical assistance. Next, I want to talk a little bit about our credit programs. Our credit programs support the export of US ag products by guaranteeing borrowing by overseas purchasers. We continuously research the economic, political, and financial risk of the developing countries and banks that participate in our credit guarantee programs, particularly the GSM 102 program, to ensure that program obligors are capable of adequately servicing the debt associated with the sales that we guarantee. We perform market research to determine where is the greatest demand or need for our credit programs, to assist in allocating our annual $5.5 billion in guarantees, and to determine eligible commodities under the program. Finally, we perform econometric analysis to determine the most relevant macroeconomic variables that impact potential defaults and recoveries, and use that data to establish program fees that are adequate to cover program costs and losses. Next, I want to talk briefly about our market development programs. First up is the Technical Assistance for Specialty Crops program that Gene also mentioned. It's a program that funds a variety of research to benefit US specialty crops in overcoming trade barriers, including successful efforts to develop a home compostable price lookup sticker and research into food safe, antimicrobial coatings and EU packaging requirements. We also have the Emerging Markets program, which is used extensively to conduct market research and assessments of the food and rural business system needs of emerging markets, and to develop recommendations for technical assistance activities to address those food and rural business system needs. Next, we go to our big market development programs, the Market Access Program, the Foreign Market Development Program, and the one-off effort of 2019, the Agricultural Trade Promotion Program. A theme that we have heard quite a bit lately is that industries need to find new markets for their products. We cannot continue to put our eggs into just a single basket or two, or even 3 or 4. The MAP and FMD programs fund tens of millions of dollars worth of market research every year. First, cooperators look for markets, then they take deeper looks into prospective markets. Substantial research has also been done on the benefits accrued from operating these programs. A recent study by Texas A&M found that the Market Access Program and the Foreign Market Development Cooperator Program yield about $24.50 for every dollar invested in export market development, and $9.6 billion in annual average agricultural export revenue. As far as the ATP is concerned, which was that one-off, there was an initial $300 million federal investment, which yielded $11.1 billion in additional agricultural export revenue. This study also asked, what if we doubled MAP and FMD? The answer was, if we doubled MAP and FMD, there would be an additional $44.4 billion in additional agricultural export revenue. In addition to that cost-benefit study, there was a study of what our competitors do in the arena of market development. We learned that competitor investment is increasing, that competitors are working to brand the origin of their products, and that the EU is outspending us greatly. They spend $665 million annually for all products, and $275 to $280 million annually just for wine alone. This is well above the $234.5 million that is set aside for MAP and FMD every year. Finally, there was a study to take a look at how the money was spent under the Agricultural Trade Promotion Program, which was an interesting study because it signifies what might happen if there was an increase in the MAP or FMD programs. It was found that there was more innovative programming, greater diversification of markets, modernization of outreach, pivot to digital marketing, and our exporters were better positioned to compete with that additional $300 million. This next slide, called MAP in the 21st Century. I have personally worked on the market access program for 25 years, helping to fund those tens of millions of dollars worth of market research. A good question is, are we keeping up with program funding? This slide, to me, shows us what status quo funding really looks like. If you look at the colors in the graph, each different color represents a different farm bill. So in the 2000-2001, a farm bill was wrapping up. And from 2000 to 2007, that was a different farm bill, the Farm Bill of 2002, which increased funding from 90 million in 2001 up to 200 million in 2007. And then you'll notice a pattern. Since 2006, the program has been funded at $200 million every year. Well, is that really status quo? Is that really stable funding? I think the answer is no. And I wanted to point this out because, you know, as we head into a farm bill year, it's important to recognize whether or not the programs that we operate are funded in the way that we might think that they are. This table shows the funding in the market access program since 2001. The vertical stripes, if you can see them, are the nominal amount of the MAP allocation. The red line is the funding level with sequestration removed. Okay, so the program's at $200 million since 2006, but around 2012, we started taking money out for sequestration. The black line takes out sequestration. It also takes out program administrative funding, which we began to take out in about 2011. The purple blob there takes out the sequester, it takes out the admin, and it also removes what would, I guess we would just call it inflation. So you see that inflation chops away at the program far greater than the sequester does or the administrative funding. The value of the program in 2006 dollars is what the purple line shows. And what we see if we look at the far right end of the graph is that in 2023, the $200 million that we get in nominal funding is only worth $114 million in 2006 dollars. To get back to $200 million in 2006 dollars would take a $350 million allocation of funds. And so I wanted to leave you with that. As the Farm Bill is expiring, these important programs that are so research-based and are so important to maintaining our export markets and to developing new ones, we need to know that the funding that we have now is far less than it was when we originally got it. And I'll stop there because I know we're way behind on time, and I'll turn it back to you, Michael. This is my card if anybody'd like to reach out with any questions in the future. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Mark. And thank you for those great and fantastic examples of how even with the U.S. agriculture industry and researchers are doing more with less, but also some powerful examples of how we have to stay competitive and keep supporting our ability to play in the marketplace. I love your example of how the EU spends more on promoting wine exports than we do on our total FMD program. So thank you very much for that. I know we're short on time. I wanted to invite our attendees to ask any questions they might have. I don't have any in the chat right now, but feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand. And while you do that, please introduce yourself and your affiliation. Okay, do we have any questions in the from the audience here? Well, let me just throw one out then real quickly, if we could just take a little bit of time. And Gene and Mark and Keith talked about investments, and particularly Gene highlighted how some of these challenges are multi-year challenges, whether it be a labeling law or an investment in a new plant or breeding technology to be safe and efficacious with our products in global markets. And we recently saw how geopolitical events in 2020 exposed the world to food insecurity. Could one of the panelists or multiple panelists just talk about how consistent long-term investment in agriculture research and agriculture export promotions are critical despite the up and downs and the unpredictable nature, like black swan events like the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Who would like to take that question?
I couldn't find my microphone.
I was
sorry.
going to say, I can't find my hand, but Mark, you go first, and then I'd like to add on to that, please.
Okay, one of the most important things, I'll speak to MAP and FMD. One of the most important things about those programs is that the participants are stable year to year. They're not exactly the same as the group that we funded 20 years ago, but for the most part, the groups are the same, not entirely. And the relative funding is close to the same, but what's really important is year to year, a group can have a sense as to what kind of level of funding they might have available to them, so that they can build strategic plans that are flexible enough to make adjustments on the fly as the world changes. So, although I mentioned having all our eggs in one or two baskets, most of our cooperators are much more diversified than that, and they can shift resources quickly from existing markets where problems develop into relatively less important markets that they may be able to build more quickly with that flexibility. Gene.
Thank you, Mark. Just to add, you're talking about our trading partners and looking at the USDA research side of it. The example I cited with the Economic Research Service being able to do a deep dive, people look at that and they're like, oh, you were able to do something in just a few months. It's always that way. It's not always that way. There are other demands. And when there is a trade barrier out there or trade opportunity, and the call is it's an all hands on deck job to try and get more details, insight into it. When there isn't consistent funding over a period of time, it means something's going to stop being done. You're going to divert resources to go and address this need. But if there are not sufficient and guaranteed resources over a long time, what gets paused while we go work on something else? And when it comes to doing the scientific research, in the case of the Pumpox virus, that is based on field trials and analysis that is conducted and tested and retested and looked at. And that's one reason why USDA scientists are a gold standard, because we have the science, we can point to the methodology and say, this is what we did, these are the trials we ran. But it takes years, and in many cases, and when funding levels aren't guaranteed, that introduces uncertainty for this scientific research on what are we going to be able to continue. As we look ahead at next year, which research projects that we're working on can we continue to pursue? which other ones might we have to be willing to put aside in the absence of having this continued funding. But in most cases, this kind of scientific research takes years to develop. And that gives us credibility as a U.S. Department of Agriculture, but it does take time and funding. I hope that answers your question, Michael.
Yeah, very, very helpful. And thank you. Thank you very much for that. And let me just ask if there's any other questions from our audience here.
Michael, I see that Karen Wilcox has her hand raised. Karen, you should be able to speak and ask your question now.
Okay, this has been very informative. I haven't kept up with USDA as much as I'd like to, but I always admire your work. And the expenditures for research, ag research, have continuously been flat for a very, very, very long time. When I was there from 2011, 2016, I had a chart, which I've tried to post here, but I can't, which I called the swoop chart, because what it did was show USDA as a flat expenditure at the bottom and all of the other research funded by the United States government swooping up to magnificent levels. We've had great results from that, but it has sometimes, I think, reduced our capacity to get to some of the things we need to do. I guess we're right in the middle of getting ready for the 2024 budget. Probably it might be almost in stone by now, so I hope not. But I just would like to urge both NCFAR and those in the department that can have an impact on the ag research budgets to pay attention to what we've learned today, because it's a continuing problem. And with climate change, with water shortages, with increased storms and loss of land in like Louisiana, we need more research, and urgently. That's my comment more than a question.
Well, thank you very much for that. And it's a great point of emphasis, and one of the reasons why NCFAR was supportive of this webinar, and we brought these particular experts in today. Any other questions? Maybe just one last question for our panelists, if we can keep it short, is a lot of times we hear about keeping up in the global marketplace, and we talk about innovation, and agriculture usually isn't brought up in that context. People think of semiconductors, renewable energy, things like that. Tell us how important innovation is in agriculture and why agriculture should be part of that narrative about innovation when it comes to science, research, funding, et cetera.
Yeah, Michael, I can address that very briefly. I think agriculture really is a technology driven enterprise. And I think it's really interesting if we look at these productivity performance across different sectors, agricultural productivity growth is about as fast as you find in the high-tech sectors. In other words, the contribution of that productivity growth to the whole U.S. economy in agriculture is just about as much as we're seeing from some of the high-tech industries and pharmaceuticals and so forth, because the productivity growth in agriculture tends to be much faster than other sectors. Even though it's a relatively small sector, when you add those two together, that you're getting a lot of productivity growth in a small sector, it really adds up. So it's actually making a big contribution to the growth of the US economy, to the productivity component of that growth.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Mark. Okay, last call for any questions for our panelists. This has been very informative and very helpful. Well, let me just wrap up. Really think it's a great way to emphasize the importance of agriculture to our US economy and the many thousands of workers, both inside the government and academic researchers and scientists that play a critical role in helping our industry, our national industry, our farmers, our producers, our ranchers remain competitive and do what they love, feed the US and feed the world. And so with that, I want to thank our distinguished panelists for their participation today. Encourage everybody to revisit this recording or share it with others. It'll be posted on NCFAR's website. Also want to just pull up real quickly here our sponsors. Thank our sponsors for the event. And I hope everybody has a great weekend and a joyous holiday season. Thank you all very much. Stay safe and take care. Thank you.
Thank you.